Welcome to the Plagues Project.
10 plagues, many angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
The 10th plague, the plague of the firstborn, is the most fearsome of the 10 plagues that God visits on Egypt. Unlike all of the other plagues, which involve some harnessing of a natural force, miraculous in some way, the 10th plague is completely miraculous. It involves the sudden, instantaneous death of an entire portion of the Egyptian population. More than simply being miraculous and inexplicable, a clear indication of the hand of God against the Egyptians, what's also distinctive about the 10th plague is that it's explicit that it cuts across all layers of Egyptian society. Even if that's implicit in all the other plagues, the text makes a point of emphasizing that specifically with regard to the plague of the firstborn. When God foretells the plague in chapter 11, verse 5, it says, "And every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle." And then again, when the plague actually occurs, in chapter 12, verse 29, it says, "In the middle of the night, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle." This obviously raises a potent moral question. If the slaves themselves, the Egyptians who were slaves themselves, were punished, what sense does it make to punish all of the Egyptians across the board, even those who were themselves slaves? Shouldn't God have judged each of the Egyptians according to their own individual merits? This is, of course, not unique to the plague of the firstborn. This is a question that we routinely ask about the way that God interacts with nature and with the world. And it's formulated most famously by Abraham when God tells him about the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis chapter 18, verse 25, Abraham says, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so the innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you, shall the judge of all the earth not deal justly?" Abraham says to God, how can you wipe out a whole city? You're wiping out innocent along with the guilty. I don't want to dwell on the moral issue because I don't think it has an easy resolution. This is a fundamental theological question that is well beyond the scope of a 10 or 15-minute video. I do, however, want to encourage you to think about it more broadly, because when you think about it in terms of other circumstances, if we're going to think about the moral issue, I think it's important to think about it in maybe more modern terms. For example, if God wanted to bring about the end of the slavery of millions of enslaved African Americans, what punishment would have been fair or just to visit on the antebellum South in order to have that occur? Again, not our issue for now, but I raise it also because in connecting this plague of the firstborn to the destruction of Sodom, we see some interesting patterns emerge. First of all, when Abraham argues with God, there's an element of the argument missing. What would have been the most logical thing for Abraham to say to God? Save the righteous and kill the wicked. And yet that never emerges in Abraham's debate with God. Instead, what happens? Abraham says to God, maybe there are 50 righteous people in the city, and therefore you should save the whole city. God says, fine. And then Abraham tries to lower the number. And we get into this kind of high stakes negotiation where Abraham tries to lower the number. Maybe there are 45, 40, 30, all the way down to 10 righteous people in the city. You should save the whole city because of those righteous people. Why is that the most just thing to do? Don't the wicked deserve to be punished? Somehow implicitly, there's an understanding that that's not always an option, and not an option in these cases. In other words, there is sometimes the option of a sweeping indiscriminate judgment to punish the wicked, or no judgment at all. And therefore, another element that we see from Genesis is the fact that even the righteous are put at risk. And this too is something that we see in the plague of the firstborn in the Exodus. Whereas in all of the other plagues, the text says from the outset that the Israelites will be exempt, that they're let off the hook. In this case, it's not automatic. God tells Moses that in order for the Israelites to be exempt from the plague, in order for the firstborn of the Israelites to be saved, they have to do something. They have to offer the Pesach sacrifice, the Paschal lamb, and they have to take the blood of the Paschal lamb and smear it on their doorposts and on the lintels of their doors. And of course, this is why the holiday is called Passover, because God sees the blood on the door and passes over their houses and smites only the Egyptians and not the Israelites. What would happen if the Israelites didn't do this? We're not told, because maybe it didn't happen, but the implication is perhaps the Israelite firstborn themselves would have been killed. The Israelites are not allowed to go out of their houses for the entire night. Again, because it says in chapter 12, verse 23, "For when the Lord goes through to smite the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the lintel on the doorposts, and the Lord will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter and smite your home." The implication is if they go out of their door, the destroyer, so to speak, might smite them down. I want, therefore, to turn and examine the story in Genesis for a little more insight into what this does to the story. In other words, if we put aside the moral issues of this sweeping, indiscriminate judgment and how can God do this, we see something interesting about the nature of the plague of the firstborn in terms of the experience that he creates for the Israelites and in terms of what it says about God's relationship with man in these instances. While Abraham is busy arguing with God, two angels head down to the city of Sodom to see whether the city is in fact deserving of the punishment that God is about to visit upon it. They come down to the city. The only person to greet them in the city and offer them hospitality is Abraham's nephew Lot. In chapter 19, verse 3, he says, "But he urged them strongly, so they turned his way and entered his house. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate." The choice of baking unleavened bread is in itself an interesting detail of the text, which the Midrash, quoted by the medieval commentator Rashi, picks up on and says, why did he bake matzah? It was Passover. Yet another connection between this episode in Genesis and the plague of the firstborn, when of course the Jews also bake matzah because they're about to leave the land of Egypt. And then the story quickly unravels. They had not yet lain down when the townspeople, the men of Sodom, young and old, all the people to the last man, gathered about the house and shouted to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may intimate with them." If ever there was a city deserving of an entire punishment across the board, a sweeping indiscriminate judgment, it is the city of Sodom. Sodom is so washed with sexual rapaciousness that every single man in the city turns out, surrounds the house, and demands that Lot send out his guests for them to be raped. As the story unfolds, we see another interesting point of connection between this story and the episode in Exodus. So Lot went out to them to the entrance and shut the door behind him and said, "I beg you, my friends, do not commit such a wrong." And essentially, Lot tries to convince them not to commit this act that they want to commit, not to commit this rape, to leave his guests alone. Lot steps into the doorway. And just as in Exodus, there's an emphasis on the door frame, so too in this episode, there's an emphasis on the door and the doorway. As Lot steps into the doorway, he places himself in between his guests inside the house and the townspeople who have surrounded his house on the outside. And then, as soon as he realizes that the townspeople are not going to be placated, the angels pull him inside the house and shut the door. And then, interestingly, even when they've shut the door, the text tells us, "And the people who were at the entrance to the house, young and old, they struck with blinding lights. They were helpless to find the entrance." There's an implication that even once they're blinded, they continue to grope around for the entrance. The significance of the doorway in this episode is, again, the liminal space between inside and out. Lot finds himself trying to negotiate between the townspeople on the one hand and his guests on the other. As soon as it becomes clear the townspeople will not be placated, his guests pull him inside. The doorway then becomes the only way into the house, of course, being where all of the people who will be saved are located. The house then is a kind of sanctuary, a refuge. And at the moment that the angels pull Lot inside, the fate of the city is sealed, everybody outside is doomed, and everybody inside will be saved. This then is one way to read the significance of the doorway and the house in the plague of the firstborn. In order for the Israelites to be saved, they have to take refuge inside their houses, and they have to trust that God will in fact save them. And this, in fact, is what happens to Lot in the episode in Genesis. As Lot gradually realizes that he has to make a choice to stay in the city or to leave, he wavers. And finally, the angels pull him out of the city and say, "Run for the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot turns to them and says, "You have been so gracious to your servant, you have already shown me so much kindness in order to save my life. It's at that moment that Lot realizes the magnitude of God's blessing to him. It's at that moment that God realizes the magnitude of God's kindness to him in saving him from the sweeping, indiscriminate judgment. It's at that moment that Lot realizes God's kindness to him in saving him from the sweeping, indiscriminate destruction. And that, I think, is one purpose of the emphasis of the doorframe and the house in the episode in the Exodus story. The Israelites, in experiencing the plague of the firstborn, being cloistered inside their houses as they hear the screams of the Egyptians who are being killed all around them, realize the magnitude of God's kindness to them. But there's another side to the image of the doorframe. And that, I think, is drawn out by the beginning of this narrative in Genesis. The angels don't begin their mission by heading down to Sodom. They have an earlier mission, which is to visit Abraham and Sarah and give them a different kind of news. And that's where we read the beginning of chapter 18. Abraham is sitting outside his house in the heat of the day, and suddenly he sees three visitors who he doesn't realize are angels, but we quickly realize who they are. He invites them in, he offers them hospitality just as his nephew Lot does. And then, as they're finishing the meal, in chapter 18, verse 9, they said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "Here, there in the tent." Then one said, "I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Here, too, we find a closed space, the tent, just like the house in stone. And like Lot, who stands in the doorway and is torn between two options, to placate the townspeople, perhaps even to stay in stone, and to protect and then eventually join his guests, Sarah here, too, is standing in the doorframe. And then doorframe, she experiences a moment of ambiguity, a moment of uncertainty. She hears the news that she's going to have a son, perhaps the first time she's heard this news. And the text says, "And Sarah laughed to herself, saying, 'Now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old? Is it possible that at age 89 I'm going to have a child? How can this be?'" The doorway here, again, is the liminal space between inside and out. But the tent here, the closed space, represents not a point of refuge, not a sanctuary, but a prison. Sarah is imprisoned by her biology, the fact that she is now past menopause, by her own psychology, life hoping and praying for a child and realizing that at this point it's impossible by any natural means. The doorway, therefore, represents the moment at which she sees a light that she didn't see before, hope, a possibility. At the moment that she hears she's going to have a child, she emerges into the doorframe, and she too responds skeptically, cynically. But ultimately, of course, Sarah steps through the doorframe and embraces that new reality. And eventually, her laughter is not a laughter of cynicism, but a laughter of joy. This too, I think, is relevant to the experience of the Israelites in the plague of the firstborn. If the night before the doorframe represented a space that cannot be crossed, lest they too fall plague to the plague of the firstborn, in the morning, the image is reversed. Now they are not Lot taking refuge in the house, but Sarah suddenly seeing a new light in front of them, a new hope, a new possibility that they never dreamed would happen. In the morning, they walk through the doorway and embrace the freedom and understand what it means to be the beneficiary of God's munificence.